Welcome to Speak Life with Dr. Amy Chai. Information for your best life. Now, here's Amy Chai.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Speak Life. I'm Dr. Amy Chai, and today I am going to talk about a very, very common disease process, and it is called high blood pressure. I often have patients who they're kind of not sure about whether or not they should take high blood pressure pills. It's almost as though they don't feel the high blood pressure, they don't have symptoms from the high blood pressure, so they don't always understand what it is or what it means to them. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today, a little bit about the mechanisms behind high blood pressure and why it's so important to treat it, and kind of what we know today about high blood pressure. So come on, it's going to be an interesting time today. We know that high blood pressure is sometimes caused by certain diseases like kidney diseases or certain sort of adrenal diseases. But for most people in the past, we really didn't know exactly why people developed high blood pressure, other than the fact that as we get older, our blood vessels harden a little bit, and that tends to create the high blood pressure. But what about people who get the high blood pressure earlier on before they're senior citizens? What exactly causes high blood pressure? What is it? So I'm going to bring up this first slide, and we're going to talk a little bit about what high blood pressure is. Now, high blood pressure you see here on this slide is measured with something called a sphygmomanometer, which is a great word, sphygmomanometer. And what it does is it measures, very simply, the pressure inside of your blood vessels. And let's imagine that your heart is a pump, right? And your heart, it squeezes and relaxes. It squeezes and relaxes. It squeezes and relaxes. So what it's doing is it's actually pumping the blood throughout your entire body. And so I have a fun little toy. And did you ever have one of these fun little toys when you were a kid? They're hard to keep a hold of. But I'm going to illustrate what happens to your blood vessels when your heart squeezes, okay? So your heart squeezes and relaxes, squeezes and relaxes, squeezes and relaxes, squeezes and relaxes. So now if your blood vessels aren't super squishy, and they're not that squishy, they're kind of squishy, but they could be squishier, but that time when your heart squeezes and pushes the blood out into the body, that's called your systolic blood pressure. And the systolic blood pressure is the high number. Okay, a normal systolic blood pressure is 120. So systolic, it happens when your heart is squeezing hard. And then there's the lower part of the blood pressure, and that's when your heart relaxes, and it's called diastolic. When your heart relaxes, it fills with blood, and then it squeezes. So squeezing is the high blood pressure, relaxing is the low blood pressure. So it's squeeze, relax, squeeze, relax, squeeze, relax, systolic, diastolic, systolic, diastolic. So this is just a fun toy, and I like fun toys. Whoa, I dropped it. But normal systolic pressure, which is what the heart squeezes, is 120. Normal relaxing blood pressure is 80. So 120 over 80 millimeters of mercury is normal blood pressure. And so the reason it's called millimeters of mercury is because in the olden days, I don't know if you ever had your thermometer checked back when it used to be like mercury in the thermometers. And it also used to be mercury in how we measured blood pressure. It was like a little column on the wall, and we would like check the pressure in it based on how high up the mercury went. And so you're basically, that is an old-fashioned based on actually mercury is how we measure blood pressure. And so high blood pressure is really anything that's above the normal blood pressure, like above 120/80, or especially when it gets to 130, 140, we start thinking about class 1 high blood pressure. And that's when it starts to be a little bit of high blood pressure. And then it goes up to 150, 160, that's even higher. So we have grades of severity of blood pressure. And sometimes patients ask me, they're like, well, when should I get really scared about blood pressure? Like, when should I like go see somebody like right now for a high blood pressure? And usually there's something called a hypertensive urgency. And a hypertensive urgency is when a blood pressure, the high number is like 180 and the bottom number is like 120, or anything over that is called a hypertensive urgency. And when that happens, you should really seek care right away. And it becomes even more urgent if you start to develop symptoms with it as well. And one of the most common symptoms with a hypertensive urgency going into a hypertensive emergency is when you might start having a headache with that, or start feeling chest pains, or start having nosebleeds, or some other symptom that's extremely worrisome. So if that does happen, you should seek care, maybe hit up, emergency room or urgent care center, or call your doctor. Though that is when you should start thinking about, I better get this checked now. But if it's in the lower range of high blood pressure, that gives you some time to go to your doctor and get checked out and see if you need treatment for high blood pressure. So the next thing I want to discuss is, how do you check your own blood pressure? Well, checking blood pressure at home is very easy now. And I have something here that's called a Omron 3. It is a blood pressure cuff that you can get for about $30 online. I got mine on Amazon, and here it is. It fell on the floor. That's why I'm like leaning over to pick it up. This is an Omron 3 blood pressure monitor. It's very simple. In the back, it has a place to put the batteries. And in the front, it has, very simple start and stop buttons. And then when you run it, it'll show the systolic, the high number, the diastolic, which is the low number, and it'll also show your pulse rate. So how do you actually check your blood pressure at home with a simple device that you get over the internet? How do you do that? Well, it's really super easy, but you have to do it right. And so I have a picture here of a guy who's taking his blood pressure at home. And how I always suggest that people do it is to sit calmly with both feet on the floor, not crossing your legs, just relaxing your feet on the floor, and then putting your arm up, like on a table, like if it's a kitchen table, and putting the machine right on the table, and just resting your arm just at heart level right on the table. And then it has a place on the cuff. You can see right here. The place on the cuff, it says like artery right here. It'll say this should go over the artery. Well, where's your artery on your arm? Well, your artery is on the inside part of your arm. Like if you hold out your arm to your side, you can feel your pulse right here on the inside of your arm. And if you think about it, the reason your artery is on the inside of your arm is, what if a tiger comes and like bites the outside of your arm, right? You don't want the tiger to like get the blood vessel. So the reason the artery is on the inside of your arm like this is to protect yourself from like predators or knives or whatever, because you've got the bone protecting yourself from the artery. So you just slide that on to your arm, and it's really easy to do. Here I'm sliding it on my arm, and then you just pull it up, and it's just Velcro. And there you go. That's all you have to do. And then all you have to do is just push this little button. Boom, it does it all by itself. It's so So easy. Now, the only problem some people have is if you have a very, very large arm, like how about them guns, right? Like you have a huge arm that's really big. It might be hard for this cuff to fit around it. And if the cuff is not big enough for your arm, you're going to have an artificially elevated blood pressure. So this is an average size cuff. But if you have a very big arm, it might be too tight for you. In that case, you might want to get one of those wrist cuffs. And a wrist cuff is the best if you also lean it on the table at about heart level, excuse me. And then you just hit the button, and that's all you do. It's really easy. And you just calmly sit there, same way, feet flat on the floor, and you just measure it and you just write down the number. It's that easy. So checking your blood pressure at home, I always recommend that. I think that's a really good idea for people. And, I do it myself. So what's the big deal? What causes the high blood pressure? And what's the big deal with high blood pressure? So this is where we get into a little bit more complicated things, okay? When I was in medical school, we learned about something called the endothelium. And what that is it's just a very thin lining, almost like a tissue paper thin lining that's on the inside of your blood vessels, okay? And in fact, there's 60,000 miles of endothelium inside of your body, 60,000 miles. There's 1 trillion cells. They're very small, very thin cells, and they line the blood vessels in your body. It's called the endothelium. So we used to think that the endothelium, like when I was in medical school, which it wasn't that long ago, but when I was in medical school, we used to think that the endothelium was just a nice, smooth lining. Okay, it was just a lining that helped the blood flow smoothly. And here in this picture that I put up, you're going to see red blood cells and white blood cells and platelets just smoothly flowing through a blood vessel. Okay, that's what the endothelium is. But we have found more and more over the years that the endothelium isn't quite so simple. And it always seems like everything's not as simple as first you thought. But endothelium is actually a very active organ. It's an active tissue. And what does it do? It produces substances that dilate or constrict your blood vessels. Now, if you think about it, what happens outside if you're hot and it's really burning hot outside? Your blood vessels will dilate near the skin and it'll make your skin all flushed, and that kind of helps your body to cool off. So your endothelium is secreting substances that help your blood vessels get larger. And when your blood vessels get larger, your blood pressure goes down, okay? Now, when your blood vessels get tighter, your blood pressure is going to go up. And your blood pressure gets tighter when your endothelium secretes substances that make your blood vessels constrict. And that might happen with something like, say, adrenaline. Now, say you're trying to run away from the tiger, you need a high blood pressure to get that blood pumping to all your muscles and stuff so you can run really fast. That means your blood pressure is going to go up and your blood vessels are going to constrict. And that's why when you're scared, your face will get really pale because, your blood vessels are constricted. That is kind of part of that whole fight or flight. And that's part of what your endothelium does. So there's a very wonderful balance between dilation and constriction, which is partially mediated by the endothelial cells in your body. But what happens if those go out of whack? And that's what happens in high blood pressure. Usually what happens in high blood pressure is that you have more constriction than relaxation. More constriction makes the blood pressure go tighter and tighter, because those substances that cause relaxation, like nitrous oxide, are actually out of balance with the things that make your blood vessels constrict, and that makes the blood pressure go up. So when your blood pressure goes up, when the endothelium is inflamed or constricted, um, then it sort of activates these little guys that are called the platelets. And the platelets are part of your blood that wants to clot. So the high blood pressure, when it goes up, it also puts you into a more clotty type of a state, or a way where your body wants to clot more. And clotting is bad. Clotting sometimes is good. Like if you have a cut, clotting is good. But, if you don't want clotting to go crazy, because clotting can go to your heart, clotting can go to your brain, causing heart attacks and strokes. So the endothelium helps to mediate that. And so hypertension is really where your endothelium kind of gets a little bit sick. And what happens is that almost half of all US adults have high blood pressure, 47%. That's a lot of people with high blood pressure. And high blood pressure helps contribute to 670,000 deaths every year in America. So this is a big, huge problem. It's a big, huge problem that there's a lot of diseases that are caused by high blood pressure. And so that's a very concerning thing for me as a physician, and also for you, because you don't want your risk of heart attack and stroke to go up. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the causes of high blood pressure, or the causes of that imbalance in the lining of your blood vessels. Okay. So let's take a look at this slide that I have up there. Okay. One of the things is going to be chemical stresses from medications, chemical stresses from alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, street drugs like cocaine, heroin, all of those type of compounds that you might ingest or smoke. Those cause a chemical stress on the endothelium that makes your endothelium sick. So one of the ways to reduce high blood pressure is to avoid smoking, avoid drinking, avoid drugs. And that's kind of one thing your doctor tells you. And, it's a long-term issue, because, the longer you use substances, then the more risk you have of damaging those endothelial cells, and you don't want that to happen. The other thing that causes chemical stress is salt. Now, everybody knows that when you eat salty food, that it makes you retain water. But did you know that, like, practically every food that we eat here in the United States is just absolutely loaded with sodium? And it's true, because sodium is used as a preservative in a lot of prepackaged foods. And it's used also as a flavor enhancer. It's like yummy, salty food. So a lot of the food we eat here in America is just really very filled with sodium, and that's really bad for us. Now, it used to be that we would think, and what I was taught when I was in medical school not so long ago, was that the reason salt makes your blood pressure go up is because it makes you retain water, and that makes, more blood volume and everything. So naturally, of course, it's going to be higher pressure. But it actually turns out that there's more to it than that. Actually, sodium itself has some harmful inflammatory effects on the endothelium. And so the sodium itself, when in excess, creates some stresses on the endothelium. Um, Another part of chemical stress is going to be from fat tissue. And everybody knows that, being overweight does cause high blood pressure, diabetes, and all those other things. But the reason is that people think that fat is just like a place where you store excess calories and it makes those little lumpy things that don't look good under your swimming suit. But that's actually not the case, because fat is an extremely active tissue. It makes a lot of chemical substances that cause inflammation. And the more fat tissue you have, the more likely you are to experience difficulties with inflammation. And inflammation causes a lot of problems. Like, um, for example, people will say, "Oh, you're depressed. It's because you're fat." Well, it isn't because you're fat, it's because your brain has inflammation, because the fat tissue produces inflammatory substances. And then the other thing that it will do is it will cause inflammation in the joints, it will cause inflammation in the skin, it will cause inflammation in the endothelium as well. So, actual fat tissue produces substances that are inflammatory and harmful. And the chemical stress, what we call oxidizing agents, free radicals, you may have heard of those things. Those actually can cause damage to your endothelium. So, you may have heard of something called antioxidants. Now, antioxidants are things that help to repair the oxidative stress caused by things like fat, for example. So, there's a lot of foods you can eat that have antioxidant properties. And one of those things is, you may have heard of the Mediterranean diet. And that's where you have, like fish, lots of dark green vegetables, colorful foods, tomatoes and spinach and greens, and also, grapes, olive oil, those type of foods. Those have antioxidants in them, and like green tea, there's a lot of foods you can eat that have antioxidants in them. And you can also even buy antioxidant supplements, but it's probably better to have, eating them through your vegetables. And vegetables also have, potassium in them and vitamin K in them and all these other healthy things that are going to be more healing towards the endothelium instead of harmful to the endothelium. So right here you can see, like, because you see some of the causes of high blood pressure, you can see some of the cures of high blood pressure through lifestyle modification. Um, and that would be avoiding toxins like, the drugs and alcohol, um, eating a healthy diet, avoiding the fast food that's filled with sodium and fat, and trying to, reverse obesity as much as you can. There's a lot of great medications out there now that will treat obesity, which is a disease, not a moral failure. It's a disease. So there's a lot of things that can help you change your lifestyle enough that will help you to avoid the stresses to the endothelium that cause the high blood pressure. So, so these things are important to think about. And when you have inflamed endothelium, remember, you're more likely to get blood clots. You're more likely to get high blood pressure. But what else are you more likely to get? Let me go ahead and bring this slide up. There's a lot of problems that can develop from high blood pressure. And I know that you've heard about them, but one of the main things we worry about for high blood pressure is heart attacks, because high blood pressure has a lot of effects on the heart. Now, if your heart is squeezing and relaxing and squeezing and relaxing, it is a muscle, right? So the muscle actually can get thicker. Your heart muscle can actually get thicker. Um, and you'll think, well, that's great. I have a stronger heart, but that's actually not great, because what happens is the heart muscle can't relax as well because it's kind of over bulked up and over heavy. So what happens is your thick heart won't relax as well. And so the diastolic number, the relaxation number, the bottom number will actually go up. And it's harder for the heart to pump when it gets a little bit like overgrown. And that's where you can get this problem called diastolic dysfunction, or it's a type of heart failure from having high blood pressure. And then the other thing that can happen is because of the problems that happen in the endothelium that cause the blood clots, you can actually get little blood clots that clog off an artery. Maybe an artery has a little bit of lipids on it, like the fat, the what we call a plaque. And then it gets a little clot on it, and then all of a sudden you have a sudden episode where there's just no blood going to part of your heart, and that's what we call a heart attack, and that can be deadly, as you know. The same thing can actually happen in the brain. And in the brain, we have, obviously we need blood, we need oxygen to our brain. It's super important. If we don't have oxygen to our brain in one part, the brain tissue can die. And that's very frightening. You can have weakness, numbness, abnormal speech, and you can certainly die from a stroke as well. Another thing that we are particularly worried about is, and this other picture, you see the picture of the kidneys there with a machine, that would be kidney dialysis or kidney failure, where you need dialysis. And this is particularly important in the Black community because Blacks tend to be more sensitive to some of the effects of high blood pressure, especially in their kidneys. So if you are a person of African heritage, you have to be even more cautious about the blood pressure. I mean, you can't change your genetics, but you can treat the problem and treat it aggressively, because you don't want heart failure, you don't want a stroke, you don't want kidney failure. These things are tragic outcomes that can be prevented with lifestyle and with medical treatment of high blood pressure. So again, I just want to bring to your attention, um, when you're on a high blood pressure medication and your blood pressure is under control, that doesn't mean the high blood pressure is gone. It just means that you have to continue treating the blood pressure forever. It is a lifelong disease. It is a lifelong treatment, and you need to continue taking the medication long term, unless you have some very, very dramatic change in your lifestyle, like a dramatic weight loss or dramatic change in the amount of drugs and alcohol that you consume. And then you might be able to get off blood pressure medications. And so don't give up. Don't be scared. You can be in control of high blood pressure. You don't need to let high blood pressure control you. Be aware of the disease, be aware of how you can treat the disease and what you can do for the disease. And you're going to be healthier, you're going to be happier. So start on your journey to blood pressure and endothelial health today. And for the next Speak Life, we're going to talk a little bit about the different types of blood pressure medications that you can use to treat this illness. So we will see you again next time on Speak Life. And we're going to talk next about blood pressure medications. So see you then.